They say if you stand alone in the ruins of Ravenwood at midnight, you can still hear them screaming. That was the first thing I ever heard about the Ravencroft family. A whisper, half drowned in bourbon and regret, from a man who never returned to New York again. What he didn't know, and what you're about to, is that the screams never stopped. They were silenced. Buried. Covered by layers of stone, shame, and scripture. For nearly 2 centuries, the truth has rotted in the cold earth beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit. Not folklore. Not exaggeration. But a deliberate system of control, pain, and death wrapped in holy language and delivered with divine certainty. This isn't a ghost story. This is the kind of truth that leaves a mark. The kind of story that makes you question whether your thoughts are really your own, or the echoes of someone else's script. Because the deeper you go into the history of the Ravencrofts, the more you'll realize something terrifying: they didn't die out, they evolved. And the systems they created? Still alive. Still watching. Still feeding. We begin in blood. And we do not stop until you understand who's really been holding the knife all along. The Ravencroft brothers didn't arrive in Ravenwood as outcasts or drifters. They came as architects of transformation, self-anointed gatekeepers to a twisted salvation. Elder Ezra, the patriarch, carried not just a preacher's tone but the cadence of command. Every word that left his mouth carried weight like a verdict. Deacon Silas, the quiet one, chronicled every step, every ritual, every sacrifice. He was the historian of horror. But Prophet Caleb, he was something else entirely. Some say he was possessed. Others say he was a master manipulator. But those who looked into his eyes swore they saw nothing looking back. He moved like a marionette pulled by invisible strings, mouth twitching with messages only he could hear. And it was Caleb who first spoke of the ascension. Not as a metaphor, but as a physical transformation through sacred agony. The body is the lock, he said. Pain is the key. The townspeople, broken by grief, poverty, and the chaos of revivalist fever, were ripe for something absolute. The brothers offered answers. Structure. Ritual. Meaning. And then they demanded obedience. No questions. No doubts. Because doubts, they said, were the language of the devil. And once you silence doubt, control is no longer a negotiation, it becomes sacred law. The first to die for the Ravencroft doctrine wasn't a criminal. She was a mother. Sarah Pembroke had lost her infant son that winter. The town says she never spoke a word after his burial. So when the Church of the Pure Spirit offered her meaning, she didn't hesitate. They called it a gift. They bound her, submerged her, branded her, and called it purification. Every scream, they said, was a demon leaving her soul. But it wasn't just Sarah. 2 others were offered that night. Michael Collins. Rebecca Winters. The town watched. They didn't stop it. Because they believed. Or more terrifyingly, because belief had already been replaced by submission. You see, when pain becomes holy, cruelty becomes a ritual. They built something under the church that night, an altar, yes, but also a theater. A stage for control. One trial after another, the body broken again and again until the mind folds in on itself and calls its tormentor, Father. And with every ascension, the Ravencrofts grew bolder. They had unlocked something few men ever achieve, not faith, but total, unyielding domination. What if I told you that every major religious structure in the region was quietly aware of the Ravencroft rituals, but said nothing? What if I showed you letters, real, hand-signed correspondences, between the Ravencrofts and several influential Protestant authorities of the era? Buried in obscure archives, these documents don't condemn the rituals, they admire them. They call them advanced mechanisms of soul refinement and brilliant applications of divine discipline. Let that settle for a second. Institutions we were taught to revere, protectors of the moral code, were intrigued by torture as transformation. And that's where this story begins to mutate. Because it's not just about three brothers anymore. It's about systems, institutions, networks. Those who watched from the shadows, waiting to adapt what they saw. Caleb's rituals became templates. Ezra's sermons became guidelines. Silas' writings, secret doctrine. And all of it filtered upward. Like a virus. Now ask yourself, if they could turn pain into a tool of devotion, what else could they turn into control? Have you ever wondered why some truths never see the light of day? It's not because they're unbelievable. It's because they're useful to the wrong people. By 1835, the Church of the Pure Spirit was no longer just a local anomaly. It had become a testing ground. Not just for religious fervor, but for psychological programming. They isolated members from their families. They redefined language, turning pain into purity, death into ascension. They rewrote identities until followers no longer referred to themselves by name, but by assigned virtue titles: obedience, humility, flame, ash. These weren't just sermons. They were scripts for mental fragmentation. It didn't stop with physical torture. They studied how long a mind could hold on to reality while the body was stripped of comfort, food, rest, and warmth. And they measured it. Recorded it. Perfected it. What you call brainwashing today was being ritualized in those stone catacombs over a century ago. And the real horror? They weren't trying to destroy their followers. They were trying to replicate something. To manufacture devotion. To craft loyalty stronger than blood. Because if you can get a man to kneel willingly in fire, you can make him do anything. The chambers beneath the church weren't just burial vaults. They were laboratories. Psychological experiments disguised as divine trials. Each room had a name. The room of stillness. The chamber of flames. The pit of reflection. But their purposes were far more sinister than their titles suggested. Followers were left alone in pitch blackness for days, sensory deprivation that eventually caused auditory hallucinations. Some claimed to hear the voice of God. But it wasn't God. It was the programmed voice of Prophet Caleb, played from hidden devices. Early mechanical phonographs rigged to whisper mantras in the dark. Your pain is your path. Your pain is your purity. Others were suspended over cold stone basins for hours, dripping blood or sweat as offerings. And as they suffered, they thanked their tormentors. Not out of fear, but because their minds had been reshaped to see suffering as salvation. The Ravencrofts didn't just break people. They rebuilt them. Into tools. Into weapons. Into missionaries of pain. And here's the part that should disturb you most: these methods didn't disappear with the collapse of Ravenwood. They migrated. They evolved. And eventually, they were absorbed by higher systems, military programs, behavioral research, intelligence agencies. You were taught the Ravencrofts were cult leaders. But the truth is far more dangerous. They were prototypes. By 1840, the Ravencrofts had exported their teachings far beyond the cracked stone walls of their sanctuary. Traveling missionaries began spreading their doctrine to isolated communities in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and even as far as Louisiana, always under different names, always cloaked in different rituals, but always with the same core: control through suffering, loyalty through pain. One group called themselves the Sons of Purity. Another, the Order of the Wounded Lamb. What united them was the quiet endorsement of powerful men, politicians, industrialists, and former clergy who saw in the Ravencrofts a mechanism for molding men into obedient vessels. It wasn't about religion anymore. It was about infrastructure. The creation of a society within society, where those in pain could be broken, rebuilt, and redirected like tools. And that's where you enter this story. Because if you've ever felt like your choices weren't yours, if you've ever wondered why guilt is used like a leash in the modern world, if you've ever felt the silent expectation to suffer in silence, perform without question, endure without protest, then you're already living under their shadow. The Ravencrofts are not a family name. They are a design. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. Who benefits when a man is broken but obedient? Who profits when you're tired but silent? Who wins when you believe your suffering makes you good? The answer has always been the same: those who understand how to weaponize belief. The Ravencrofts knew that pain made men compliant. But they also knew something deeper: pain makes memory. You can forget comfort, forget peace. But you never forget the pain that changed you. So they used it to brand the soul. That's why the rituals weren't just tortures, they were indoctrinations. Every scream was a syllable of reprogramming. Every gasp for breath, a lesson in obedience. Over time, their techniques were borrowed by elite boarding schools, military hazing rituals, secret societies. Not by accident. Not as tradition. But as the perfect formula for one thing: shaping loyalty through trauma. The reason you've never heard this in history class is because those who rewrote history were already inside the machine. The Ravencrofts didn't need to survive as men. Their legacy survived as method. And you've seen it. You've lived it. Whether in the rituals of the powerful, or the quiet sacrifices demanded of the weak. In 1851, Prophet Caleb vanished. No grave. No body. Just gone. Official church doctrine claimed he ascended, his body too pure to decay. But survivors tell a different story. Whispers say he fled to Europe, where he continued his work in secret societies operating under Masonic cover. Others claim he was taken by those even more powerful than himself, because he had gone too far, too deep, and risked exposing the hidden structure behind his entire movement. And that's where things get darker. Because if Caleb wasn't just a madman, if he was a recruit, a cog in a far older machine, then the Church of the Pure Spirit wasn't an origin. It was a test site. A prototype. And Ravenwood was simply the first visible bloom of a much deeper root system. A system designed to do one thing: remake men from the inside out. Not by love. Not by reason. But by pain, isolation, and belief. The ancient blueprints of control have always included a prophet, a ritual, and a sacrifice. What changed in the modern age is that the sacrifices became invisible. Now we're bled spiritually. Psychologically. And we call it life. If you've made it this far, you're already different than most. You're not just hearing the story, you're feeling it. That's the beginning of awakening. So now, I want you to do something. Pause, and type the phrase, "I return to the fire." I remember the shaping. Type it twice in the comments. Once for the past they erased from your memory, and once for the future you're reclaiming now. This isn't just engagement. It's a signal. To yourself. To the algorithm. To the shadows that still listen. That you're awake. That you will not be shaped without consent. Because everything from here gets heavier. Darker. Deeper. We're not done falling yet. We're only halfway to the bottom. And what comes next is the real reason they tried to bury this story. You were never meant to know this, but the Ravencroft doctrine was not created in a vacuum. Deep within Silas Ravencroft's private writings, confiscated by federal agents in 1864 and buried in restricted archives, was a journal titled Codex Seraphim. It wasn't written in English, or Latin, or any known religious language. Linguists who reviewed it found traces of Sumerian, Coptic, and Proto-Hebrew, blended into a ciphered script only Silas could read fluently. Inside were diagrams. Rituals. Psychological sequences designed to break the human identity into fragments, and rebuild it. Each sequence was paired with biblical references, warped and inverted. The garden wasn't a paradise, he wrote. It was a pen. And the serpent wasn't the deceiver, but the liberator. Let that settle. Silas's private theology wasn't Christian. It was older. Far older. It viewed suffering as the divine engine of becoming. Pain as the gateway to authority. But here's what's most disturbing. This codex didn't originate with Silas. Several entries mention it being given to him by a burned man from the east. Someone who came in the dead of winter. Who knew his name without introduction. The Ravencrofts may have believed they were prophets, but they were also pawns. Pawns in a game that stretches back beyond the church. Beyond America. Beyond history as we've been allowed to know it. Throughout the mid-19th century, as the Ravencroft network expanded, strange patterns began to emerge across seemingly unrelated events. Fires in mental asylums. Unexplained disappearances near rural monasteries. Entire congregations vanishing from isolated churches in the Adirondacks. Always the same signs were left behind, symbols scorched into walls, journal pages mentioning the shaping, bodies with identical scars in the same spiral pattern. The authorities dismissed them as isolated cult activity. But a handful of military intelligence officers began connecting dots. One, Major Thomas Albright, compiled over 400 pages of evidence suggesting that the Ravencroft ideology had infiltrated certain theological colleges and even military chaplain training programs. He was found dead in 1858, officially ruled a suicide. But the rope used to hang him bore a symbol traced back to Caleb's original chamber, two serpents devouring each other's tails. The old order had eyes. And anyone who got too close to naming it was erased. Silenced. Or worse, absorbed. Because the Ravencroft system didn't just rely on secrecy. It relied on silence. Complicit silence. That same silence echoes today. In corporations. In media. In the way pain is glorified and submission praised. The Ravencrofts may have vanished from maps. But their blueprint never left the room. We've been trained, conditioned, to flinch from the truth when it carries too much weight. To label it madness, conspiracy, or fiction. But what if the fiction was always the narrative they handed you? What if history isn't what happened, but what was allowed to be remembered? In 1862, when the unmarked graves were discovered under the Church of the Pure Spirit, local authorities made only a brief report. Ritual abuse suspected. Records sealed by federal order. That's all the world got. But deep in military archives, black folders, no author names, you'll find the rest. Photos of dissected skulls, marked with ancient glyphs. Children's bones arranged in geometric shapes. A map showing how the church's underground catacombs aligned perfectly with astrological constellations, not Christian, but Babylonian. None of this was random. It was a ritual machine. A place designed to manipulate reality by sacrificing suffering into the structure of time and memory. That's why the Ravencrofts were never just a cult. They were engineers. Tuning human pain like a frequency. To open something. Or perhaps, to feed something. The story you're hearing now? It cost lives to uncover. Because every time the full truth surfaces, something in the dark reaches up to bury it again. There's a reason the elite today still gather in secluded forests. Still wear masks. Still recreate rituals under the guise of tradition. Because what the Ravencrofts tapped into, works. Not just metaphorically, not just symbolically, but functionally. Pain, isolation, and repetition break the individual. Strip away resistance. And what remains can be shaped into anything, a servant, a zealot, a weapon. Modern psychological warfare techniques, MK-Ultra, conditioning experiments, sensory deprivation tanks, all trace back to the same core philosophy: destroy the ego, reshape the self. But where do you think they learned those methods? Not the lab. Not the university. The Ravencroft catacombs were the true classroom. The brothers wrote it all down. Passed it along. Disguised it in spiritual language. and handed it off to the highest bidders. This is why some of the most powerful men in history have visited Ravenwood in secret, even after its collapse. The rituals may no longer bear crosses or candles, but they still bear fruit. Pain, my friend, is no longer a byproduct of power. It is the tool by which power is maintained. And you? You've been trained to believe that your suffering is noble. That obedience is virtue. That questioning is sin. Who do you think programmed that? Now ask yourself this: why was Ravenwood wiped off the map? Why did all records between 1862 and 1870 vanish from federal registries? And why was every remaining Ravencroft family member either mysteriously killed or absorbed into government institutions with no further trace? Because someone realized the Ravencroft methods were too effective to destroy. Too efficient. Too valuable. So they didn't dismantle the system. They privatized it. It didn't vanish, it rebranded. The same rituals became initiations. The same psychological splits became training. The same identity erasure became service. The difference now? Consent is manufactured. You sign up. You beg for it. You call it success. Performance. Manhood. But it's the same leash, just gold-plated. The same control, hidden behind motivational slogans. Push harder. No pain, no gain. Grind. The doctrine of the Ravencrofts is now your culture. And that's the greatest manipulation of all, when you no longer need chains. Because you believe your cage is a throne. You've probably felt it, haven't you? That quiet sense that something's always off. That beneath the ordinary routines of your life, work, taxes, entertainment, faith, there's something watching. Pulling strings. Guiding outcomes. You might have called it paranoia. But what if it's the last part of you that hasn't been programmed? Because here's the forbidden truth: the Ravencroft ideology didn't end. It metastasized. It split and embedded itself in the invisible architecture of modern life, institutions, industries, even family systems. The guilt you carry for not being productive enough, strong enough, pure enough? That's Ravencroft. The sermons you hear telling you to embrace hardship without complaint, to break yourself for the good of the collective, to bleed and smile and say thank you? That's Ravencroft. They turned obedience into virtue, and compliance into morality. And they did it so thoroughly, so masterfully, that most men today confuse their shackles for honor. The Brotherhood didn't need to survive in name. It survived in your expectations. In your silence. In your willingness to endure and call it righteousness. But now that you see it, really see it, you have a choice to make. Because once truth enters a man's bones, he either rises, or returns to sleep. Let me show you how deep the spiral goes. In 1957, a now declassified MK program ran a series of loyalty trials on military volunteers. Subjects were isolated, sleep-deprived, and exposed to sounds, light flashes, and controlled pain. The result? Their self-identity fractured. They accepted new names. New orders. New truths. Sound familiar? That's because the Ravencroft writings were among the source texts used in the design of those trials. Government agents uncovered Silas's Codex Seraphim decades earlier, and used it as a manual. They called it psychology. But it was theology, rebranded. Caleb's Voice of Angels became the prototype for audio programming. Ezra's Seven Trials became the framework for elite hazing. This is not metaphor. It's documented fact buried under layers of bureaucratic misdirection. Every time you hear a story about a broken man rebuilt to serve, whether in cults, corporations, or elite fraternities, know this: you're hearing a Ravencroft echo. Their legacy is not dead. It is functioning. And most terrifyingly, it is invisible. Because the best prison is one you don't even know you're in. And the best manipulator is the one you're trained to thank. Do you understand now why this story was never told? Not in schools. Not in books. Not in sermons. Because if men knew that their suffering wasn't divine, but designed, everything would collapse. Control depends on reverence. On fear. On mystery. But I'm ripping the veil now, and I need you to hear this. You were never meant to obey. You were never meant to kneel in pain and call it progress. You were meant to remember. To see. The Ravencroft doctrine has always feared one thing, the awakened man. The man who no longer sees his chains as sacred. The man who no longer associates obedience with goodness. That man is dangerous. Because he can't be shaped. He can't be sold. He can't be sacrificed. He becomes a mirror, reflecting the system's cruelty back onto itself. And every empire built on silent suffering trembles when that mirror appears. So if you feel rage, grief, fire rising in your gut, good. That's not weakness. That's memory. That's the part of you they tried to drown. You're waking up. And the shepherds are watching. I want you to look around your life with new eyes. Where do you suffer silently? Where do you kneel and call it honor? What thoughts in your head were planted there? What reflexes aren't really yours? Because you weren't born afraid. You weren't born obedient. You were made. Slowly. Carefully. Like the followers beneath the church, conditioned inch by inch until you couldn't remember your own name without asking permission. This is how generations are shaped. Not with war, but with whispers. Not with chains, but with meaning. The Ravencrofts didn't need to be remembered. They only needed their methods to become culture. And that's what happened. Pain became currency. Guilt became compass. And the soul? Just a file to be rewritten. But now that you see it, you don't have to play their game. You can take back your fire. You can become the man who doesn't need a prophet, a master, or a ritual to justify his power. You can become your own sovereign system. But only if you choose to see through the fog, and never look away again. Now you know. Not the version they allowed. Not the myth shaped for textbooks and TV. The real truth. The blood-soaked, soul-warping, identity-shaping truth of the Ravencrofts. They were not just three brothers. They were a blueprint for control. A proof of concept that has echoed through centuries of manipulation, refined, funded, and repackaged for the modern world. And if you think it ended when they disappeared, think again. Every time a man breaks and thanks his captors, every time obedience is praised while courage is punished, every time suffering is spiritualized to justify the system, they win again. But not today. Today, you've remembered. You've seen the pattern. You've traced the lineage of your invisible leash. And if you type those words, I return to the fire. I remember the shaping. Then you've done more than hear a story. You've lit a signal. One they can't unsee. One you can't unlight. This truth isn't safe. But it's yours now. Use it. Spread it. And never forget, the deeper you descend into darkness, the more power you reclaim from those who built it to blind you.